Okay, so I was trying to think of a topic for this video, and there's a number of things I do want to bring up in the next few videos, but I think for now this will be as interesting a talking point as any. Um, Incidentally, I'm not trying to get some sort of beard record, but this is getting a little bit long now, so maybe in the next video you'll see I'll have lost this caterpillar growing on the side of my face. Yeah, but seriously, I think that a good topic to discuss here would be how we communicate online versus the real world. Now, I like to think that I'm as consistent as possible, but I'll be absolutely candid here. I don't take exactly the same approach online as I would in the real world, and um, I don't want people to misunderstand that. I'm never dishonest. I'm never insincere. What I say online is what I believe, and if pushed on the same subjects in the real world, if asked about them, I'm not going to lie about it. But I do feel that cyberspace provides a sort of medium that you wouldn't necessarily have in the real world. And I'll try and give an example of what I'm talking about here. If you are with a group of friends in a pub, I'm using that as an example because it's a common sort of place to meet up in the UK context, and in other countries, I'm sure there's equivalents, cafes or whatever it would be. You wouldn't necessarily talk about the same things that you might interact with online. You may discuss politics, you may discuss social issues, but it's more like you'll discuss more light-hearted issues. Now, I talk a lot about political and social issues online because I'm genuinely interested in those subjects, but I wouldn't necessarily open them up as a subject if I'm with friends in a pub. With friends in a pub, I'd likely talk about more light-hearted subjects. Um, that's not to say that I would never discuss, current affairs or politics or something, but I do find that there is a different context to it. And I wonder if anyone watching this has a similar experience. Um, there's this great thing online about, and I've done it myself. I've accused people of saying things behind the screen that they wouldn't say in the real world, and I do think there are some particularly aggressive viewpoints or aggressive approaches that people take that they wouldn't necessarily say in the real world. Now, sometimes I can be quite sharp online if I feel strongly about something, and I make no, I don't deny that. It's what I do. And I have been in a few situations in real life where I've been in heated debates or at least in exchanges of view. But I do think if we're being absolutely candid, there is a sort of barrier that comes about on cyberspace that you wouldn't necessarily see in the real world. To give an example of this, when I see some of the attitudes coming out from really nationalistic viewpoints, um, I often wonder, well, what this person is saying, I find it very obnoxious. And if I met that person in real life, would I like them as a person? The chances are, if you meet someone for the first time, you're not automatically going to know their positions on social political issues, and you may find that they're a likable enough person on first meeting. I think only in a few circumstances can you really, really work someone out in the first minute or so. Most people do take a little bit of time to work out. So I've been engaged with people online in, strong exchanges of view. I've seen people whose views I find really quite abhorrent and obnoxious and arrogant. And I'm sure there are people who have seen my views that way. Um, and it sort of makes me wonder, well, does cyberspace create, is it a positive thing or is it a negative thing? I do believe that this technology can utilize a very, um, it can utilize a way to communicate that can be positive because it lets us keep in touch with friends who may be on the other side of the world, and it allows opportunities to voice our opinion. For example, what I'm doing right now. That's not to get into the issue of internet censorship, which is That's for another video, but it does exist in certain countries. There is definitely barriers to certain websites, and that's something that obviously restricts how much we can communicate. But generally speaking, in countries with fewer internet barriers, you have quite a lot of flexibility online. Quite a lot. In the UK, we're far from perfect. There is actually legislation that is being discussed or proposed um, to curtail certain opinions because they're being classed as hate speech or whatever. Now, I think this is very problematic, and I think we need to be very, very wary of it because it is something that if we don't keep a check on it, sooner or later it is going to get into a situation where, frankly, we're not much better than China. Now, at the moment, we're a long way from that, but it's not so. We shouldn't be complacent about this. In fact, when it comes to internet freedom, the UK doesn't rank even in the top 20. We're not in the bottom 20. We're on the higher scale of things, but we're still, I think there are some areas where, for example, in hate crime legislation, that, in my opinion, is being misused. But there's a whole nature of trolling. Now, what do we mean by trolling? I think this is very, very important to determine. Unquestionably, there are people who do cowardly things online. They harass people, they're nasty to people. And I do believe that cyberbullying is a problem. Um, but I think as a cyber community, we also need to have some understanding of what we get ourselves into when we choose to interact on cyberspace. And in a sense, we need to possibly toughen up a little bit because there are people online who will say unpleasant things and there's not much you can do about it. Now, I think there's a big difference between someone being oversensitive and someone, you know, basically having their final straw because they've been putting up with harassment continuously. There's a big difference between the two. So there will be people who are oversensitive, but there will be others who are not oversensitive and they've been genuinely harassed. And the latter is a sort of trolling that goes well beyond trolling. I don't. I believe that groups and political parties should be absolutely subject to criticism or ridicule. That is very different from harassing an individual. So if I dislike something a political party has done or a particular group has done, I believe that there should be freedom for people to dissent and to go onto that group and say why they disagree with it, or even to insult it as a group. That's different from attacking an individual and harassing an individual. So, for example, I may like certain political parties, but I'm never going to inbox an MP and send them threatening messages. I may dislike them personally, I may criticize them, but I think everyone has a responsibility, and there's a big difference between criticizing someone and harassing them in a very personal way by sending them inbox messages. I'll be honest, I've been tempted at times to say exactly what I thought of someone, but I've always held myself back and thought, well, wait a second. If I do that, I'm just as bad as they are. And I'm not pretending that I'm holier than thou. I have said things occasionally online that I haven't been particularly proud of, um, in a very sharp way. Um, I've always provided some sort of basis for the point that I've been making, but there are times that I recognize I could have done it in a better way. But I'm just going to put this question out there. Do you think that, hand on heart, I mean, I would put this question to everyone watching this. Do you personally, the people watching this video, can you honestly, hand on heart, say that the way you interact online, now maybe you don't upload videos the way I do, but let's say if you respond to Facebook news stories or news feed stories or whatever it is that exactly the way you communicate in the real world? Because I think most people, if they're being absolutely honest, the answer would be no, because the context is different. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Now, clearly, it's a problem if someone's being completely two faced and completely fake. Like they are, I don't know, let's say they're pretending to have a certain set of values in the real world, and they're completely contradicting those values on cyberspace. Let's say, for example, they pretend to be really okay with gay people in the real world, then online they come out with really extreme homophobic statements. That's obviously inconsistent. It's just an example. I'm not saying that's, any more prominent than anything else. I'm just using it as an example. I think people should be as sincere as they can, but that doesn't mean that the context of cyberspace is exactly the same as the real world. I think there are differences. For one thing, in the real world, you have to listen to the other person, and you can't just talk the way I'm doing right now. You have to listen to what they're saying as well. So there's that dimension which is different. On cyberspace, if someone pisses you off, you can just block them. In the real world, you wouldn't always have that option. On cyberspace, you have to put up with things like hackers and people who use those sort of approaches because they don't like what someone else is saying. I've been a victim of that. I've had my Facebook account hacked. Um, so there are certain risks online that you wouldn't necessarily get in the real world. On the other hand, in the real world, there are certain risks that you wouldn't necessarily get online. So, for example, you can have a heated argument with someone in another country online. In the real world, you could find yourself subject to possibly violence if you were to really speak your opinion in their country or vice versa. So I do think there is a different dimension online. Or the thing about violence, it could apply in sporting contexts as well. Say, for example, I can criticize football hooligans online, but I couldn't go up to a drunk yob in the real world and say, by the way, you're acting like a criminal, because he or she would likely put a bottle across my face. So there is a different context, and it's not necessarily entirely a bad thing to understand that it is a different context. I don't think it is necessarily hypocritical, as long as people are honest in themselves. Speaking for myself, I try to be consistent, and I am absolutely prepared to back up anything I've said in these videos. Someone ever challenged me and said, Nathan, why would you say that? I would be very ashamed of myself if I were to be a card and say, oh no, I didn't mean that, or blah, blah, blah. I didn't really say that. Or I would like to think that if I'm ever a public figure, it might be that I change my mind on something and I say, well, okay, that's how I felt at that time. And if people have taken that in a certain way, perhaps I could have worded it in a different way. But what I wouldn't want to do is completely retract from it and say, oh, I never said that. I think that's a card's approach, and I hope I never do that. But I do think people change their mind and their opinion. That's part of human self evolution. It happens. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway, that's something for people to think about. Once again, that pitch. I may have brought this question up before, but I think it's an important question, a very important question. Do you think the way people communicate online or the way they voice themselves online is, incidentally, there's parts of the world where people may, for safety reasons, they would say things online that they can't say in the real world. Maybe because they're part of an oppressed minority. Maybe they're showing a false identity online. I've seen that a few times. And whilst I used to sort of think that was very deceptive, I think in some cases it's understandable because they have to do it. They have to use a false identity. They've no other choice because they may end up facing a backlash from extremists or from an oppressive government. Um, so yeah, let me know your thoughts. Do you think there is a big gulf between how people communicate or interact online and the real world? And you personally, do you do that? You may not upload videos, but do you communicate online in a different way from the real world? My impression is certainly from the feedback I get from my subscribers. Um, my impression is people are very candid and they're very open in their views, and that's a good thing. I try to be myself. I think it's important. That doesn't mean people are obliged to be, absolutely lay themselves bare, but I do think people should be as candid as possible. Um, Deception's not a good thing. Okay, let me know your thoughts and thank you for watching.